we're off and we're live and we're recording. And this is our second podcast episode, Conversations with Dr. D, we've been calling it. Our first one was with Dr. Nicholas Lamp, the School of Business, the Law Faculty of Queens. Our second one today is with Mr. Stephen Mason. It's being done remotely. Stephen's sitting in his office in Calgary. National Indigenous Day today. And I think it's appropriate that we have Stephen on the podcast today for precisely that reason, which is going to become clear as we walk our way through. Before I say hello to Stephen informally, I'll give you the formal, at least a bit of the formal bio, because to do the entire bio would take most of the podcast. Stephen's had an enormously impressive career as a Canadian businessman, and I'm just going to read some of the things that he has done. He is currently Chief Executive Officer and Senior Managing Director of Project Reconciliation, Chairman and CEO, Reconciliation Energy Transition, RETI, in Calgary. Seasoned leader and advocate for Indigenous empowerment, particularly in the energy sector. With 4 decades plus of experience, he's played a pivotal role in developing domestic and international energy business opportunities. He's the founder and vision behind the Project Reconciliation and Reconciliation Energy Transition, at the forefront of an Indigenous-focused initiative to establish a foundation to grow inclusive Indigenous intergenerational wealth in Canada through securing majority Indigenous ownership in major infrastructure and energy transition projects, including the 100% Indigenous ownership of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Something that's currently in the newspapers and, people are following with clear attention. I'll just skip through a couple of other things here because, again, it's a very long and impressive biography. One of Steve's key contributions was conceptualizing, initiating, negotiating, and developing a fully integrated energy project in Tanzania, involving a capital expenditure of $220 million. This project included the proving and greenfield development of a world-class natural gas resource, establishing gas processing facilities, a marine and terrestrial pipeline, a natural gas-fired power facility, and associated transmission. Steve has also fostered capacity development and built strong government relationships in East African countries as Tanzania, Kenya, and Mozambique. And I'm just going to jump to the end because there's a couple of awards I wish to mention. Steve's dedication and vision for Indigenous economic empowerment, recognition, including being awarded the Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee Medal in Alberta for that outstanding work. And so clearly, not only is your work having a local Calgary impact, it's having a provincial impact, it's having a Canadian impact, and it's having a global impact. So welcome to the podcast, Stephen, and thank you very much for taking time to be part of it.
Well, my pleasure, David, and thank you for having me. And again, my extensive career, it was a long list of all the journey that I've been on. But I'd like to say hello to everybody that's on, and also recognize from my perspective that in terms of land, I sit on Treaty 7 lands, which comprise of 3 Blackfoot Confederacy nations of Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, as well as the G4 nations that consist of the 3 Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina. It is something in our transformation that is very much needs to be recognized as we have these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, if we were having this conversation even as little as 5 years ago, I probably should have done myself, but we wouldn't have begun it with those dedications. And that marks kind of a sea change in our attitudes towards and our approaches towards reconciliation, which I know will be a theme that we'll be talking about all the way through. Before we get there, I mean, the first thing obviously people would want to know, I gave you a little bit of your background, again, a little bit out of 40 years, but tell me the things that you think I missed and people should know about, where you started, what you've done, and what you've learned along the way.
Well, and, given we only have 2 hours, and given that I've been in my career for about 45 years, we're going to try to make this the Reader's Digest version. But I started my career in the investment banking business in Toronto. I was born and raised, educated in Toronto. And then went to work for a company called Dominion Securities. And during the 70s, when, in fact, the whole transformation of the energy business, oil and gas industry, came about by OPEC being formed in 1973. And on and around that time where OPEC was formed, oil was globally trading at between $3 and $5 a barrel, which was quite remarkable that you could produce and move oil out of the Middle East and get it into the North American markets, and they only had to pay $5 a barrel. OPEC was formed, and by the end of the decade, oil ran from $3 to $5 a barrel to $30. And in the investment business, that's really was the genesis of the explosion of our Canadian oil and gas industry. And at that point, a number of startup companies started to look at the opportunities within our Canadian basin, and we're looking to raise capital. Getting through that, I was moved out to Calgary and got very active in the oil and gas business. I always had an interest, and then went to work for a large Canadian company. At that point, it was called Canada City Service. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of City Service out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was ultimately bought by Occidental. And Canadian Oxy bought Canada City Service. And I ran their business group. And in that, it was the early days of deregulation of the industry. And I went on to form all the marketing functions at Canadian Oxy. And then my entrepreneurial spirit really blossomed. And I left Oxy and formed a gas marketing company, which I built and then sold to Enron in 1990. And then went on to start up a number of different smaller E&P companies where I had a good team of geologists and geophysicists, and we would traditionally go out, work up plays, drill up exploration anomalies, prove it up, get it on production. And then I went on this journey in East Africa. And my journey in East Africa effectively started with me getting on the plane 6 weeks after 9/11 and going to a country that was 45% Muslim peoples. And I had my choice of seats, I might add, because no one was flying 6 weeks after 9/11, and certainly not to a Muslim-based part of the world. That journey really opened my eyes to many things as we went on to deploy over $200 million in capital and prove up a world-class natural gas resource of multiple TCFs of gas in a region that had zero electricity. They didn't have any power, and it was quite evident of the poverty when you don't have what is obvious to us Canadians when we turn the switch on. In fact, there's a story that goes with this, and again, my age, I would get to be a bit of a storyteller, but these things just come to memory. I was there I was there for an extensive amount of time, but this one memory in itself was in 2003, and I was I had a driver and a shotgun person and a couple of my vice presidents, and we were hungry, and there was no restaurants because there was no electricity, and this part of Tanzania was very prevalent in cashews. And so when you're hungry and there's cashews, we stopped at a little town square where there were some ladies that were selling cashew nuts under this big canopy of trees that kept the shade. And sorry, I turned my phone off. And as I looked out the window, and the poverty became so evident when you just see it, I reflected on what we were doing in terms of bringing reliable and affordable power to the region and how that would look to transform the people of the region. And I turned to my vice presidents and said, I want to come back here in 20 years and see what a change we made. Well, if you all do the math, that was in 2003. And we're now 20 years later. And interestingly enough, I was reached in by a big conference management company called DMG that are holding an energy conference in Dar es Salaam in September of this year. And they approached me because they did a lot of research into the history of Tanzania and asked me whether I would be interested in being a keynote speaker at that conference, which just happens to be 20 years later.
Comes around, goes around.
Yeah, just quickly to get through that. I mean, my journey in East Africa opened my eyes to many things, and that is building partnerships with the landowners, the people of Tanzania, the governments of Tanzania. And really, my eyes were awakened to the neo-colonialist world of sub-Saharan Africa, which was still very prevalent. And I hope it isn't as prevalent today as it was 20 years ago, in terms of how business was conducted, and that would be the colonialists coming in with their bags of money and dictating the terms and how they were going to deploy the capital. Whereas I had a vision is, okay, you have the land, you have the resources, we have the expertise and the capital. Let's have a conversation about what is your goals and objectives, and you for to understand what is our goals and objectives, and get to a place that truly was the basis of a partnership. And it was quite interesting watching the dialogue, watching the body language of, what's that all about? Because we're just used to the colonialist way. But in any event, in that journey also include a lot of things we did with building schools and community development centers and sustainable development projects. And it was an acronym we lived in under those days called CSR, which was Corporate Social Responsibility.
Yeah.
And now we've got ESG. And but my point is, when I got back to Canada, it opened my eyes to the colonialist world that still existed in Canada. And that was a system that we built with our Indigenous peoples when treaties were signed 200 years ago, where we created reserves and we created social net that effectively maintained our Indigenous peoples on reserves. And that lens for me changed when I came back, and I've been on a mission ever since. So bit of a synopsis, David, of what my career has been, but my journey in East Africa set the stage for what I'm doing today in Canada.
Now, you've opened a lot of doors there that I'd love to explore. One is just going to be your early career. So a lot of my students, my undergrads, are thinking they've got the entrepreneurial bent, but don't know if they do or not. But you worked for...
Careful what you wish for.
You see, established firms for a number of years and then moved into the entrepreneurial space successfully. Is that the way to do it, or is there no way to do it? You just do it and hope it works, or...
Well, it doesn't come without resolve. And, really, when you look at the drivers behind our economies, in both, whether it's Canada, whether it's the U.S., it's driven by that entrepreneurial spirit, where you come up with an idea. And an idea only stays as a good idea on a whiteboard unless you can truly put a business plan together around it. And you also have to be prepared to take some risks. But usually where you take risks comes reward. And, you just can't jump into both feet. You really got to sit back and understand where those risks are and understand what truly is the business that you're visualizing. Can you finance it if it's a business that requires capital? And there's a bit of a motto that I have had in my life that I'm just going to show here that sits on my credenza, and it's don't quit. And,
a motto or a motto?
Yeah. And then it's also about having passion.
Yeah.
A friend of mine passed away about a year ago. And he was a business leader, an entrepreneur. He was a community leader. There was maybe 500 people at his funeral. And one of my friends got up to give a small eulogy. And it basically was, the true testament of who Brent was and his mantra in life, which he passed on to his staff, his family, his children, and his grandchildren. And it is, if you're going to do something, do it with passion or don't do it. So, all of those that are listening and are out considering a vision around an entrepreneurial idea, figure it out, get your plan put together, identify the risks, do it with passion, and don't quit.
Now, that's a great way. There's certainly lessons that young people, everyone kind of needs to know if they want to get into the business world, indeed for lots of other things. Got a couple of things I wanted to ask you about for your opening stories. What was it like when you were going into Tanzania or even in colonial Canada, and who have all suffered under a couple hundred years of colonial experience, and then you come along and say, well, let's talk and trust me and trust us, and we can... That had to be, you had to hit a lot of roadblocks when you initially on that. Am I right on that? Is that true, or is that?
Well, there's no question. I mean, it starts when you've had such a generational basis of colonialism, mistrust, and undelivered promises. It takes a long time to really gain the trust. And in that journey, when I went over 6 weeks after 9/11, I only went for a couple of weeks, and then I went back in January of 2002, and I spent 200 consecutive nights in a hotel. Meeting with various levels of government, meeting with the bureaucrats in and around that, whether it was their national oil company or their utility, and for that matter, senior politicians, right up to the president. And if you're going to build trust, and a lot of what was the error, whether it's in our own country, going and trying to establish a relationship with an indigenous community, you can't just fly in and have a 1 week kind of get to know you and expect you're going to build the trust. It takes time. It takes commitment. It takes being prepared to listen to what that other side of the potential partnership truly is, their drivers, objectives, and for them to hear and understand what yours are. And really just get to that table discussion around, let's get all of that on the table and truly understand each other's objectives and get to a common place of understanding. Because that's the only thing that drives partnerships. And that is so prevalent with our Indigenous peoples of Canada.
Well, when I teach, in my classes, I talk about the issues of political risk, and I argue the most important risk or issue is how do the local people who live there feel about you being there? And if they don't, you can talk with senior people, but there's also the people on the ground and all the way through, and you have to nurture all of those things for a long period of time. It sounds like it was a lot of work.
Well, it was, and it wasn't without the trust of marriages, too, which is another thing that if you're considering entrepreneurial spirits, be careful about your marriages or what could potentially be your future marriages. When I've been in a hotel for 200 nights in Tanzania and I wasn't coming home on weekends, it didn't do very good justice to that marriage.
Well, I mean, I read the histories of a lot of successful entrepreneurs. One of the more famous ones in the oil industry was John Paul Getty, who I'm sure you've heard of. I think he had 5 wives. I mean, it is a hard life. Entrepreneurs, very demanding, and something to keep in mind for people as well when they're thinking about their personal life, for sure. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit more about what you're doing now. Tell me about RETI or RETI. How it should be said. And what are you doing?
Some people say tomato, some people say tomato. It's RETI. I like to lean towards RETI for a change. But I want to go back to what really was the bigger vision at the beginning, and that was what is under the vision and brand called Project Reconciliation. Okay. And when I came back to Canada, I purchased a small little oil company that had a few hundred barrels of production of heavy oil on Indigenous community lands in Saskatchewan. And I developed a very good relationship with the chief and council of that community. It was called Thunderchild. And the chief, his name was Delbert Wapaz, was really looking to take his nation to more economic sovereignty. And we became friends, and he'd often ask me for advice on some business deals he was looking at. In fact, he came to a point where he would often say, Steve's the first white guy that's come along to give us advice without giving us an invoice, because it wasn't about that. And in any event, and just to quickly get to how Project and the genesis of bringing material Indigenous partnerships to corporate Canada started, I got a call from Chief Wapaz one night, and it was about midnight, and he had just received a call from Husky Energy on a pipeline spill that just had happened into the North Saskatchewan River. And the most impacted landowner to that spill was Thunderchild First Nation. And he had got a call from Husky that they wanted access to the lands. And the relationship between Husky and Thunderchild hadn't been good from some legacy issues. And so Chief Wapaz asked me what he should do. And I said, well, Chief, this is very unfortunate that this has happened. If it proves to be negligence on the part of Husky, the price is going to go way up. I said, you're going to have to let them in because they need to assess and look to contain and plan to remediate. But I said, the first thing you got to put as a condition, the only real thing you got to put on as a condition is that Thunderchild gets vendor status to do the cleanup. And by 6:30 in the morning, they had vendor status. And typically, if you're a company, a service company in the oil industry, and you want to get vendor status on a big oil company, it could take you 6 months to a year to qualify. Because they've got very stringent kind of criteria to get on the vendor list. And again, Thunderchild had vendor status by 6:30 in the morning. Just obviously, Husky was very motivated to get access. That led to a cleanup, but my relationship with the senior executives at Husky, I went over, after a few weeks, and I said, you guys have got to do more than just clean up your mess. And that led to ultimately a 10-year strategic partnership between Husky and Thunderchild, which enabled a bunch of service work and some real economic opportunities for Thunderchild. And so anyway, I went out and had lunch one day after all this with the CEO of Husky, and we were sitting having lunch, and there's Rob Peabody, and he mentioned that he really got to understand and appreciate Delbert and his vision for economic development and his ability to articulate that, and paraphrasing him, he said, as a shipper on Trans Mountain Pipeline, we've got to change the model to bring material Indigenous ownership rather than just have consultation discussions about promising jobs when we're building a pipeline that go away when the pipeline's finished. And he said, Delbert would make a great Indigenous leader to lead that. And he said, Steve, you should get involved. And I literally looked across the lunch table and I went, geez, Rob, I was thinking of retiring. And I came back to my office, which wasn't this office. It was the same furniture, because this furniture's been with me for 30 years. And I started to reflect on that conversation. And as I looked out the window and started to think about, one, our Indigenous peoples maintaining in poverty and the structure around that, and two, from an industry perspective on getting infrastructure-based projects, not just pipelines, high voltage transmission corridors, vital infrastructure that is needed, that the model's been broken, and we needed to change that. And we need to change that by bringing material landowner Indigenous participation. David, I've spoken at a number of conferences, and when I get introduced and asked about really what the vision is, and when I say this is about bringing material Indigenous equity ownership to major infrastructure projects, I stop there. And then I look out into the audience and I say, when I say material, I don't mean 10, I don't mean 15, I don't mean 20, I don't mean 25. It's a minimum of 30% participation in these projects to ensure there's a place at the table, a voice at the table when it comes to the environmental protocols and monitoring and all those things around that, but a voice at the table that has a say in the whole development. So I got to just tell you this story because this is very important of how we get to it. So when I got to this vision of bringing Indigenous ownership to Trans Mountain and purchasing it from the federal government, and as anything is back to the entrepreneurial side, when you have a good idea, you got to figure out what you're going to call your idea. So I had a public relations firm, and we were having these getting everything ready, and we had this one session one afternoon with a group. Room full of people in this boardroom and a whiteboard as long as you could write full novel on. And there was a guy up there trying to, lead a basis of what are we going to call this initiative? And he started with, what is this? And I said, this is a vision on reconciliation. And he wrote it up on the corner of the board. And then they started talking about various Indigenous cultural, the prairies where they have certain cultural symbolisms of the prairie animals and the birds and everything, and as you get into the mountains and then you get down to the coastal, it was just an array of how do you pick one of those? And I kept looking at that word reconciliation, which is actually a noun. And really the vision came to what we are doing here is this is a project of reconciliation. We're making an active verb out of this word that's been misused and mistrusted by Indigenous peoples. Now it turns out we are...
You would use that as a verb? or as a noun?
An active verb of the noun. Project of reconciliation.
Yeah, it matters.
The word reconciliation is a misused word when the Indigenous peoples hear it, because it's been a promise that hasn't been delivered forever.
Okay.
So it started on this journey of the pipeline. We built a basis where I hired a team specific to it, where we got finance ready to purchase 100% of Trans Mountain from the federal government. We spent a lot of time on understanding the ownership in all the nations and all the territories that were impacted, and coming up with an ownership model that allowed a more fair and equitable ownership for those communities more impacted, owning more of it than those communities that are 100 kilometers away from the right-of-way, and a governance structure that allowed for a voice without having 129 board members. And I tabled, and within all of that, then in that finance ready, where we did a number of trips into New York and Toronto, and working with, that time was the National Bank. And the view was, because the shippers have a 20-year capacity-based commitment of space in the pipe, to do a project-based funding, which would be a series of bonds being issued. We even got the bonds priced, and then to get to a point that once we figured out the cost of the funding, a sinking fund to retire it, what's left over for the discussion of free cash flow for the ownership to the Indigenous communities as we're having the conversation. And that number totaled at that time, and it's not too far off even given, and I'll get into more of the specifics of the pipeline, but it totaled about $430 million a year of free cash flow that would come off of 100% ownership of that pipeline after you service the debt in a sinking fund. And then that revelation moment came to me about, if we just continue on that disbursement, which is the deep-rooted problem of the Indian Act, is here's your check. No need to leave reserve, just stay there, is really the root of the problem with the Indian Act. And the vision came to create a generational wealth, an Indigenous sovereign wealth fund, where a material portion of that $430 million would get reinvested in other infrastructure projects, pension fund-like projects, public-private partnerships with municipalities on infrastructure, high-voltage transmission corridor that impacts Indigenous lands, and that's the capital base to be there as an investor, as an owner. And we got out on that journey on what this meant was more than just the ownership, but this generational wealth creation. And then this thing called ESG started to percolate.
This is all before ESG.
Yeah, so it was before ESG, and then the street started to pick up on, the S of the ESG, and to check the S box, Indigenous partners, and geez, I've heard about this fund that this guy Steve Mason's kind of visualizing. So I started getting inbounds by all the big utility companies,
sure you would.
all the guys, and say, so where's your fund? I'm still waiting for the damn government to sell me the pipeline.
We're going to talk about that one.
Yeah, we'll get there. And then in and around ESG, obviously, was the start and the genesis of energy transition and to move away from, less carbon emission energy. And that really was the genesis of the inbounds from the likes of these big energy companies. And that was how reconciliation energy transition was created, the RETI. So it started with a vision on project reconciliation, which is making an active verb out of that noun and in and around the pipeline. And it's now, as we've been in this hurry up and wait for the pipeline, where we have close to $3 billion of capital projects in the Calgary area, which includes carbon capture, sequestration, in the very early stage of a sustainable aviation fuel project to deliver SAF into YYC, servicing WestJet, Air Canada, the big cargo carriers, and the key piece to that is a material Indigenous participation in all the way through that value chain of SAF.
Wow. So just to summarize, you've got pipeline interests, you've got sovereign wealth fund interests, and you've got non-carbon-based energy, new renewable projects interest, all under one banner.
Well, two different banners, because the pipeline sits over here in Rec Inc., because, when we bring stakeholders in on the others, they said, is that going to confuse this? Sorry to talk with my hands. It's another thing with my age. So, it's the same vision of bringing material Indigenous participation, but, we ring-fence the energy transition business outside of the movement of bitumen crude to Tidewater.
Now, one of the things I read, I do a lot of reading with Stephen Paker, and one of the things he's always noticed is once you know something, it's hard to imagine what it's like not to know it. So I'm going to ask you to tell the people who don't know, how exactly do you make money out of a pipeline? Like you got making oil over here and you ship it through a pipeline and you sell it. How does the revenue structure work? Why is ownership so critical? Or what? And secondarily, if the indigenous groups perhaps don't have a lot of capital right now, how can they get into the point where they can have some material ownership? So just the basics of those two things.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And the whole business of pipeline ownership and building pipelines is all in and around the cost of service and a rate base on the capital. So you earn a rate base on the capital. So you deploy the capital and the tolls are set at a place where you get a rate-based rate of return. And depending on where the risks are, gives the level of how much that toll needs to be. And so what drives it is you deploy the capital, and then the shippers who signed 20-year commitments to move their oil to Tidewater have committed to a space in the pipe, whether they move a drop of oil or not, that effectively rents their space in the pipe. That is factored on a rate-based toll that's regulated through the Canadian Energy Regulator, such that you can't take a monopoly situation. It has to be a rate base that the regulators approve. So you build these things in and around where your cost of capital is, including the debt and layers of potential equity, whether it's just pure common or stacking of some preferreds, where you get to where there's a margin and a rate of return. And as again, if you've got 20-year commitments of big balance sheet companies like Cenovus and CNRL and all the big guys, then the rating agencies look at this and say, well, there's not much risk to this, so your cost of money is here, and then the formula works out to what is assumed to be debt leveraging to the equity, and then in the early days of establishing the contracts for Trans Mountain before they went shovels in the ground was to give a 9.8% return on equity, which assumed 60% debt piece in the capital stack that was assuming a spread over the bank rate at the time, and that's where you made your money, was on that spread. But I think the key piece in this audience that is undoubtedly very much becoming aware of where we're moving ultimately away from fossil fuels, and specifically oil. What was interesting in my journey with Trans Mountain discussions and the anti-pipeline activists and the climate activists were saying, and using the Indigenous story as a scapegoat of, why would you bestow a liability of a dirty oil pipeline on an Indigenous ownership? And as I've said and had many conversations with almost all of the 129 leaders, this is about owning a corridor. And at some point, and that corridor is a very valuable piece of real estate, and at some point that corridor will be repurposed for zero-based carbon-based fuels. Most likely hydrogen, most likely in the form of ammonia to ship it. And once that transition moment happens, that switch turns, that piece of real estate is going to be incredibly valuable. And you want to own it today in advance of when that transition point will happen. And David, the body language that I get from the chiefs are absolutely categorically, you're right, because as soon as that moment happens, we're going to be pushed out.
So the real estate of the pipeline is what matters, less than what is actually flowing through it at any given time.
And in the meantime, the world needs oil until we find out how do we replace it with hydrogen and get hydrogen distributed. So, the world needs energy, and you might make your money on it while it's in that transition point.
And this is important because pipelines have a long life. I mean, Trans Mountain in 1959, I remember I was doing some work on it, and now the new expansions. But once you own it, it generates money for a long period of time, given proper maintenance and upgrades and all that.
Absolutely. And the technology now in and around these pipelines, David, with the monitoring systems they've got now and all the digital work around that, I hate to use this word, but if there's a popcorn fart of pressure differential, the instrumentation pick it up.
Well, one of your colleagues at CIA Group for me was working with a company that, we're doing fiber optics in pipelines, and the pipeline loses half a cup of oil anywhere.
It shuts down.
It shuts down, and they know it. So it's very. I think this is a story that I would like to tell a bit more. We don't have to do it here, but the improvements in safety regarding how we do, and in carbon capture and emission, and we're lowering that Canadians. It's been a great story. I don't think we tell it very often about the energy sector's ability to mitigate some of these risks and lower carbon in its general even while they're still producing oil.
And I got to just mention another point of my journey globally and my journey in East Africa, and what is recognized globally, and I witnessed it firsthand, is the Canadian standard of environmental practices is as strong as you will get anywhere. What is recognized when I was getting in the early stages of development of bringing our Canadian standard of environmental practices, as opposed to, I'm not naming names of other countries, but whereby we rank at the top in terms of our standard.
Well, that should be a competitive advantage. I mean, one of the things I sometimes say is people like working with Canadians. Some of these other companies or countries have shall we say, reputation of bullying behavior.
We won't mention any names.
No, we won't. I'm sure you've never seen it. Just a rumor. But
I got to tell you, life is full of funny stories. In my travels when I lived in London and had a place in Spain, and obviously living on an airplane with all the work I was doing over there. And quite often I'd get mistaken to be an American. And someone would say in Spain or wherever, so where in America you're from? And I'd say, well, I'm Canadian. And they'd apologize profusely. They'd think it was an insult. And I'd say, no, it's not. We're all brothers.
All good.
But Canadians have very good reputations globally when it comes to business practices, environmental practices around that, and truly how we do business. And it comes from a point of integrity and handshake, and our word is our bond, and that's maybe real specific in Alberta, but it's certainly my mantra in life. The only thing we end up dying with is our integrity, and did we do it right?
Well, this is why I make the argument in my writing that it's good for Canada to be out there in the world selling carbon-based products and being active for a lot of reasons, not just the economic ones. It raises our reputational gains among other places, does lots of good things for us. Anyway, back to TransX. Now, the pipelines in Canada are sagas. I mean, Keystone, right? I keep going. It goes back and forth between American administrations. TransX, we've been talking about it for what, 8 years? 10.
Well, it started as a vision in 2007 by Ian Anderson.
Yeah.
And Kinder Morgan. So it's been going on almost 20 years since it started as a vision.
Why? A couple of things. Why is it so slow? And why is it so expensive? I mean, just a couple of years ago, it was valued at $7 billion. Now it's 30. I mean, what's going on here in Canada and pipelines?
Okay, well, I think it starts with the whole lead into this conversation on a broken model, which constitutionally is part of our Constitution, is the duty to consult when you're going to build these projects. And that consultation process, even though it wasn't Ian Anderson, I know Ian, he's a good friend of mine, but it was about promising of jobs when you're building a pipeline. And by the way, once the pipeline's finished, jobs go away. And, just a classic case in point to this, David, and the audience. So I was having a meeting a few years ago when I started this journey, or early on in it, with the chief and council out at Kamloops First Nation, or Detomasi as it's pronounced. And I was talking about what it would mean for them impacted by this, in their territory, this right-of-way, to own it, and what that means in terms of dollars and the sharing of that $430 million. And the chief, this woman who's Rosalind, I forget her last name now. It's another thing with older age, you start to forget names.
Oh, I do it too.
and she stopped me and she said, "Steve, I got to ask you a question. I'm interested to know if you know the answer." And I said, "Oh, shoot, fire away." And she said, "Do you know what the Kamloops Nation is earning per year in surface lease rentals for that pipeline, for the existing line?" And I said, "That is a very good question, Chief. I have no idea what the industry is earning." And she said, $1,200 a year.
Wow.
At that time, 300,000 barrels a day are flowing through their lands. You want to do ease of numbers, put $100 a barrel and look at the value of the oil flowing through that pipeline over a year, and that the Kamloops got $1,200.
Now, why was that? Was it just...
Well, David, it's partly is once the pipeline's buried and the land's put back, do you really see it unless you're standing right beside the pumping station? It so happens that there was a pumping station in the Kamloops area. So once you've disturbed the land and built and constructed the pipeline and put the land back, then 3 years later, when everything grows back in, the vegetation all glows, and all the various microorganisms of life regenerate themselves. Is there really an impact? But I'll tell you where we took this vision to the next level. And early on in the vision, it's one thing about disturbing lands when you're building it, but as I just mentioned, it gets put back for the most part. The other thing is the impact on those ships that pick up the crude in Burnaby, take it out through Vancouver Harbor, out through the South Sea, and over to China. Who's buying it? And all of that impact to the marine life and those communities that watch the ships go by every day versus on land. Once your land's put back, really, is there that much of an impact? Other than if there was an incident, a disaster, then obviously there's an impact. So we got on a journey and we linked up on an understanding agreement with a company called TK Shipping, which is one of the global largest shippers of what's called Aframax size oil tankers, and they're very active on the LNG side too. And they had come up with a design of a eco-friendly tanker that was 90% noise reduction. Basically, it was a separate drive unit of electric motors that within 120 nautical miles of shorelines, it would flip over to the electric motors that don't have that same combustion noise, combustible engine knocking noise below the water surface. And then it also was to be fueled by LNG. And we brought together a group of Indigenous communities to come into an ownership piece of those ships. Now, it got put on the shelf as everything got delayed, but just back to your question on cost and how did it get to that. So the consultation where, they would go through an exercise of consultation, what they defined as a consultation, a permit would get ordered or would get issued. Then there'd be a legal challenge around, was it thorough enough? And a decision would be made at various levels of court that it wasn't, so pull the permit. They'd have to go back and do it again. And in the case of Trans Mountain, they did it 4 times.
4 times.
4 times. And so that continual delay under a broken model of just talking about jobs did contribute somewhat to the cost, because you got standby, you got all this capital that you've spent, and now it's delayed for another 3 or 4 years. And there's also been acts of God. I mean, there's been floods, there's been fires, there's been COVID. There's been a number of aspects that also have contributed to the cost overrun, but largely, should this project from visualization to completion taken 20 years? No, it shouldn't. And that is partly around the model has been broken of how we effectively put these projects together. And then by having it, and again, I'm going to keep using that material indigenous ownership into these projects where they truly see the benefit from the ownership versus just the promises of jobs that ultimately go away once the projects are built.
Now, I remember just from the history of oil that I've looked at, that same dynamic was happening in the Middle East in the 60s and 70s when, it was international, largely British and American oil companies that had monopolized most of the oil extraction from the area. But over time, the local people who lived in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, started to realize how little money they were getting for their own resource. And it started the process of nationalization that led to the national oil companies we see today. My sense is that the indigenous communities of Canada are becoming much more sophisticated. I don't know how it sounds not quite the way I want it to sound, but they're much more sophisticated in their knowledge and capacity about what is going on their own lands, and they're driving a harder bargain, and rightfully so. Is that true?
Well, yes. I mean, a lot of people don't give credit to Indigenous peoples to be educated enough to understand what does this mean? What does it mean? Can we look at this from a business perspective? What does that ownership mean? And that's again another complete misconception. And this has been a part of the challenge too on what's taken so long for the Indigenous piece to get up to the table. And it's interesting in this journey, David. I've had a number of people will come to me and say, "Okay, how many of you got signed up?" And, my reaction is, well, we got a lot of people interested, but until they know what the deal is, what are they signing up to? The federal government has to frame how they are going to transact this. And what does that look like? And give more credit to the Indigenous peoples on their ability to assess and understand and make an economic decision. Show me the deal.
Yeah.
The old movie that was out there, Show Me the Money?
Yeah.
Show me the deal.
How can you sign up to anyone when the check is not blank? It's blank. You don't know that's your check. So why is it that there's such a delay on the federal government trying to?
Well, David, again, I tabled the first offer to purchase 51% on Minister Bill Morneau's desk as he was finance minister in July of 2019. And I was sitting in his office, and I had our banking support there, and I had Delbert was there, and a couple of other Indigenous leads were there. And he had already had the proposal, but we were there to articulate it. And, we had a really good conversation, and, there was some really good conversation around it, and some humor, and everybody's getting along. And then in the end, basically, the message was, Steve, we're just going to build this thing first, and then we'll figure out something. Of course, my position was, well, here you go, as another basis of probably, in the views of the Indigenous peoples, what will be an undelivered promise. And your Prime Minister, or our Prime Minister, it happened to be in June of 2019, so 1 month earlier, when he announced the permit being reissued again. And at that public announcement, he categorically stated, quote unquote, the sky's the limit for Indigenous involvement, whether it's 25, 50, or 100%. And so the point I was saying to Minister Morneau is, one, there's a point of mistrust by the Indigenous peoples on generations of undelivered promises. And two, when you look at the potential protests against this pipeline when it's getting built, and, if you have Indigenous ownership early, then they're less likely to be up there protesting and making it a challenge to get it built. And he said, I know, Steve, but we're still going to build the damn thing first. So, David, they are close to the proverbial last spike. It literally is in its last stages of, I think there's out of 1,200 kilometers or just under 1,200 kilometers of pipeline. There's literally less than 100 left to go, and it's all laid out and ready to go. So they'll be hydro testing this pipeline, as we move into probably August, if not September. And they'll be just, getting it commissioned, and it'll be flowing oil by first quarter of next year. And so now they're talking about it. We're having conversations again with the federal government about it.
Okay, so just to give our viewers some context, Germany gets its natural gas from Russia cut off in the wake of the Ukrainian war, and we were talking about this before we started recording. And within 10 months, it has built a liquefied natural gas floating LNG facility in its North Shore, and it's got 5 more it wants to have done by the end of the year, and probably will get it done. Australia has a number. It's one of the world's, if not the world's biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas. We have 18 projects on the go, on the docket, and not one. This one might get completed, as you said. This is oil for, fall of this year. How come the Germans can do 6 and we in 2 years?
Yeah, so first of all, the technology in floating LNG is really perfected a lot. I mean, one of my journey in East Africa, where on the Tanzanian side, we proved up multiple TCFs of gas on the Mozambique side, which was part of the same delta and sedimentary basin, where it was ultimately proved up 180 trillion cubic feet. Floating LNG was really starting to come out in terms of being able to go to where the gas is, liquefy it under a flotilla infrastructure, and then ship it to the markets. So that's gone a long way in terms of the technology where you effectively can just dockside it. You need civil works around that for storage and all of that stuff that needs to be part of it. But, LNG Canada, and that's been really our big project that ultimately got through to permitting, and it is getting close to completion. First of all, I have to give significant credit to my friend Susanna Pierce, who's the in-country chair and president of Shell Canada. And she, at the time, was senior vice president of external relations, and she really worked at that whole basis of Indigenous involvement and stakeholder engagement, and she truly gets a big part of the credit for getting that ultimately permitted and ultimately to final investment decision. The testament on where things are moving a bit. So you've probably seen the announcement around Pembina buying out a 49% interest in Cedar LNG. And Cedar LNG is a floating liquefaction basis, and Haisla First Nation is a 51% partner. So here's a case where those developers came in, looked at, if we're going to get this done, we got to ensure that there's a material landowner Indigenous participation. And, the whole basis of the impact from a floating LNG versus having to disrupt all the land and build it all on land, I think certainly helps to expedite it. But my hat's off to the Germans to have been able to turn it around as quickly as they did, even though it was floating. And it's amazing when you're looking at your energy supply being cut off and how quickly you can react to ensure that your people don't freeze in the dark because there's no gas from Russia. So, they're typically a race of people that, as I've said, will measure 3 times before they cut. For them to have turned that around was a remarkable feat. And I certainly applaud them for how they were able to fulfill meeting their energy needs at the time that gas from Russia was getting cut off.
Well, one of the concerns I have is I think people underestimate the centrality of carbon-based fuels still in the global energy mix. And one of the things the Germans also had to do was refire some coal plants because they were phasing off some nuclear, because at the end of the day, I sometimes think Canadians are enormously privileged in terms of, we don't typically have those sorts of geopolitical things right on our doorstep. And I would like us to be a bit more aware of as you were talking about way at the beginning, what it's like for people not to have energy at all and what it means for their development.
And, we take it for granted in the world we live in, where you turn the light switch on and it just comes on. And in those times where we have those power outages and you can't turn on your TV, or your fridge isn't keeping your food cold, or your freezers aren't keeping your food frozen, it is definitely that moment of what? It's always been there. What do you mean? And the world needs energy. And yes, we got to focus on less carbon, no question about it, but it's a long road to that. And, wherever we can decarbonize and, we're on a post-combustion basis, capture that carbon and permanently store it is a big part of that journey to get less carbon and potentially at some point zero emissions.
So you're bullish on carbon capture sequestration? You think the technology is strong enough to deploy? And I've heard some criticisms that, an earthquake's going to let all the captured carbon back out again and stuff like this. Are you optimistic on the technology?
No, if there's an earthquake and it's going to do that kind of disruption, we've got more to worry about than some CO2.
Yeah.
Which, really, we breathe CO2. It doesn't affect us. If it's carbon monoxide, then yes, it's lethal. But CO2 is not lethal. Where it is, it's the global warming effect of it getting to the atmosphere. If there was an incident, it's not disastrous. It's not pretty, but it's not disastrous. But the point is we're not just turning off that switch. Even if you look at EVs as the mode of transportation for our cars and any of our mode of transportation that involves us moving around, with the exception of air travel, that energy's got to come from somewhere. And there's only so much capacity for hydro. There's only so much you can do with renewables. They all play an important piece of the bigger puzzle. But carbon capture and sequestration, if we're going to meet these global objectives, it is a big part of it. And absolutely, categorically, the technology is there. Our Calgary project, which was awarded to us, it's the East Calgary Carbon Sequestration, Transportation and Sequestration Project. And we went up against all the big guys. We went up against ATCO, Pembina, TC Energy, a bunch of other major companies. And we were technically there. I spent a couple $1 million on really understanding the storage reservoirs east of Calgary with some outside consulting companies and my own staff. And we made the application to the Alberta government on applying for the storage permit for the Calgary region. And the Alberta government awarded it to us, and awarded it to us over all these guys, these big name guys that I just mentioned. The energy minister at the time was Sonia Savage. I happened to meet her at a SIA event, David, that you've been to at Christmas time, and I went over and to thank her for her decision when she was energy minister to award the hub to RETI and its partner. And she looked up at me. She said, "Steve, you earned it. You were technically there, but your key differentiator, which was my deciding point, was that you brought Siksika Nation in as a 40% partner. And all the other guys were just talking about partnerships, talking about their relationships, but you did it. And that was your differentiator." And we've taken a hard look as we continue on that development feasibility moving into FEED, which is going to be about a $400 million capital project for transportation and injection and monitoring wells, and will be built to be able to transport and store 10 million tons per year for at least 200 years of capacity.
Okay. It's no little thing. That's an amazing accomplishment.
And in that, we're having significant conversations with NMAX, who is the municipal-owned utility on the big power, the big emitters in the Calgary region. We don't have the heavy industrial base that you would see in Edmonton, where there's far more things like refineries that post-combustion more CO2. But when you need the power to power a population of 1.4 million people, and we don't have hydropower out our back door, and there is no way you can build enough wind generators and solar panels to serve a population, it's gas-fired power generation that is, when we move to capture that emission and permanently store it safely, then we've decarbonized the power requirements for Calgary. And absolutely, categorically, the technology and the safety and environmental practices are there. And we have the support of Siksika Nation. We have the support of the City of Calgary to develop this.
Now, I'd like to. We're about an hour and 10 minutes into it, and I want to start moving up back to a bit more of a macro perspective, both on the conversation around energy in this country and just the general overview of the business competitive environment that you've seen in your career. As I talk to some individuals, I feel a bit of fish out of water. I grew up in the Cochrane area, and I know the oil and gas business from that, and then I reside in Southern Ontario, and there just seems to be a real divide in the business culture in the country about the importance of energy in terms of the country's economy, its contributions to it. It seems to be taken for granted. And as someone who's lived and worked all over the world, but primarily in Alberta, what's your take on us in how we approach this particular industry as a country?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to my comment of, certainly what became clear to me in our global recognition of our environmental practice being at, the top standard of the world, and it's recognized. So we do bring that reputation globally that when we do it right, and we do it with significant, environmental practices that protect the lands, protect, everything around the lands. Yeah, you're going to have those isolated incidences that happen. And you're going to have to, ultimately rectify those, like that time where Husky had its pipeline spill. But the world needs energy, and Alberta plays a big part of that. And as we're talking to your students, David, and as they're looking at their careers, yes, the commitment by the Canadian energy sector is to move to, meeting climate objectives as much as we can, but we can't do it without the cost and the impact to ensuring that we do have the ability when we turn the light switch on that the energy's there. Because that's a driving part of economies is having energy. And when I look back at Tanzania and that journey and it's sitting there having that visualization to go back in 20 years, and what was really driving that power or that poverty was there was zero power. If you had a vision to start a welding business, without power, you can't do it. So we need power. We need energy. And there is a place for oil and gas. And certainly as we decarbonize as much as we can along the way, and obviously gas is less emissions. And, the other challenging point is in the developing world. And as the economies are growing in the developing world, like places like Sub-Saharan Africa and, South America, and truly there's an economic engine, really gaining some momentum there. They need energy to be able to progress that. And the ability to turn the switch and just go to zero-based energy is just not a reality. We have to be focused on it. We have to apply where we can zero-based carbon energy forms, and certainly renewables play a big part of that. This evolving technology about small modular reactor nuclear power is becoming more of an alternative of zero-based carbon energy. And hydrogen is definitely going to be the fuel for the future. There's no question about that. Now, as I'm sure the audience knows, you've got green hydrogen, you've got blue hydrogen. There's got to be both in terms of the scale we need to take the gigajoules that relate to 100 million barrels a day of just on the oil side, let alone the gas, and turn it into just driven by hydrogen. You can't just do it with green. You've got to combine the various aspects of getting to hydrogen and taking our vast natural gas resources and moving that through a process of reformation that effectively strips the carbon molecule off of the hydrogen molecule and the hydrogen molecule chain and permanently storing the CO2 is the basis of blue hydrogen to complement green hydrogen and move the world to a zero carbon based fuel. That takes a lot of technology around the movement of the hydrogen. Hydrogen is a much smaller molecule than the natural gas molecule, and it's got some challenges on moving it in terms of, if you're looking at a pipeline, for instance, it's currently moving oil or gas. You either got to take that hydrogen in the form of ammonia and move it in the form of ammonia and then strip the nitrogen out of that to get back to the hydrogen, or you got to sleeve it. So we got a lot of technology that has to work around hydrogen, but that's not going to happen overnight. And so the world needs to understand in this transition that hydrocarbons still play a role, and where we can continue to do things like carbon capture and permanent storage, we can get there still meeting our energy needs and, strive towards the basis of hydrogen as that alternate fuel and the renewables that start to. But I have impact in all of this. I mean, when you start to look at renewables, you need battery capacity. And when you need battery capacity, you need critical minerals. Lithium is a key mineral that you need for batteries. And then when you start to look at the extraction industry around lithium and the impact that has on the environment, and if anything, it's interesting. I've been getting some significant reachbacks from the government that just approved this battery plant in Ontario of $50 billion. And that their condition around that was that you got to source your critical minerals from Canada. And now we're getting inbounds about, well, you need to bring the project reconciliation model into this, because if we're going to go back truly into the extraction business for lithium as part of the critical mineral chain, then it has to bring Indigenous partnerships to it. It all back to the same point.
Well, this is the main point I want to kind of move towards as we move towards the end here. I mean, you started this whole project was a vision that you talked about. The vision for RETI was X, Y, and Z. Now, how 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what would, if you, as you move perhaps at some point move away from it, what would make you think you've done it? What would say, okay, this vision has been accomplished? What would that look like, and how would we know it when we got there?
That's a very good question, David. And, obviously, when you talk about 5 or 10 years from now, I certainly will be retired. So,
yeah, you've said that before. And okay, we'll see it. Wait.
Maybe not like 100%, but in any event, as we start to build out this major infrastructure, I've got an incredible team around me, and, they're, both technically, financially, etc. But, where do I see that I've checked the proverbial box? I'm already seeing evidence of it, David. We're already seeing that the Indigenous peoples are firmly at the table on a lot of these projects. My vision that started maybe 2 or 3 years early, as I said, and there's not many places that I go to across Canada, places like Toronto, that when you're starting to socialize, in and around any kind of, social event, glass of wine, and you get to that, so what do you do? And vice versa. And then when I bring up the name Project Reconciliation, and I say, have you heard of them? And have you heard of our vision? And the reaction is, absolutely, we've heard of what Project Reconciliation is. So it's getting out there. Corporate Canada is starting to recognize it as that's the way they need to progress these projects. And I think, what ultimately will end up being a majority, if not 100% ownership of Trans Mountain, there might be another major player in there, will be the true testament of where we've made the change. And everything I'm doing in and around, when we're having conversations with the airline industry about delivering sustainable aviation fuel into Calgary International Airport, and having conversations with the airlines, WestJet, Air Canada, the big cargo carriers. And when they hear there's an Indigenous component to this, they're like, you get to read body language during the COVID when we had these Teams calls. And when people lean into the screen, either they're about to get mad at you or they're really interested. So in a lot of the Teams meetings that we've had with the airline, when they hear this solution as we're bringing it together with, where's the feedstock coming from? How's it going to happen? And it comes with a material Indigenous participation in it. It's like, where do we sign?
So well, yeah,
recognize
we talked about earlier, like this is not the first time that the business community has been, there's CSR and now there's ESG and the social components have always kind of been there. But this one feels a little different, this era, as we might finally do it, at least on the social side.
Well, it's damn a long time overdue, David. Treaties were signed going on upwards to 200 years ago. And, it's damn overdue. I've never had a racial bone in my body. I judge a person for who they are. I don't care what color their skin is. I don't care what their religion is. I don't care what their sexual persuasion is. If they're a good people, I want to be your friend. I grew up in a generation of we and they to our Indigenous peoples, which I could never comprehend it. And my children, who are in their 40s and have given me a bunch of grandchildren, grew up in that generation too, without any racial biasness. And I got a bunch of grandchildren. And if anything, what's driving me on this mission is I don't want my grandchildren to grow up in a generation of we and they. It's all we.
Well, that's not a bad place to end it. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say, but on National Indigenous Day, I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of the whole point of what we're doing here. Is there any final words you want to sort of say in addition to those? Those are pretty good ones.
Well, is what I understand as being a number of the viewers on this podcast, which is the future decision makers for our country, our industry, our business, our economy. I encourage the next generation of decision makers to come into this with eyes wide open. Recognize what we need in terms of energy, recognize what the cost is to go to energy transition. We have to transition over this. I encourage the future decision makers to really have that very objective view on things and look at what we've been doing in Alberta is very much being a major provider of energy into, every time you get in your car until you start getting into EVs and get on airplanes. Our Canadian energy industry is factored in. When you look at where do you want to build your careers, that's, as a guy that just reminisces on stories and experiences. And I can remember when I was relatively young, and my grandparents were looking at cell phones, which were like big shoe boxes, and saying, "Wow, I don't know where the world's going with the technology and where you guys are going to be." Of course, now we see things going with AI, and what I have is my advice for my grandchildren of what careers they should pursue. I don't have any easy answer to that, But let's just, next generation of decision makers, let's go in with eyes wide open, understand all of what these pieces. I do encourage entrepreneurialism because that truly is what drives creating jobs. And, if you got an idea, really, spend some time around it. As I mentioned early on, a good idea only stays a good idea on a whiteboard unless you can put a business plan around it. But that's what drives our economy. That's what drives job creation. And I encourage the handover to the next generation of decision makers. So, you got my best in terms of whatever we can do to give some advice along the way. But I'm excited as we now move from a different perspective of ensuring that we're all at the table and equal on these visions.
Stephen Mason, thank you very much for spending some time with me this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with all the podcast viewers.